In this video, I will be going over one way to assemble the trigger mechanism from a Mossberg Maverick 88. Let's start by removing all the components from the assembly. This method of assembly starts with the safety crossbolt. Pay attention to the orientation as you insert it into the trigger housing. The small stud should be facing the back of the assembly. Add the disconnector spring to the floor of the trigger housing and partially add the trigger pin to hold the disconnector spring in place. Push the sear pin into the trigger housing a small amount. Push the long leg of the sear spring up against the front wall of the trigger housing as you lower the sear spring coil onto the sear pin. Lower the sear onto the sear pin. Use tweezers to pull the bent leg of the sear spring over the sear. Push the pin all the way into the trigger housing. Add the action lock lever pin to the left side of the trigger housing. Add the action lock hammer spring to the action lock lever. Rotate the action lock lever to fit through the trigger housing slot. Then rotate it back to its normal position. Locate the coil of the action lock hammer spring onto the action lock lever pin and push the action lock lever slightly forward so the pin aligns with the hole in the action lock lever. Add the spring bolt release to the other side of the action lock pin and push the action lock pin all the way into the trigger housing. Lower the trigger into the assembly. Tilt the trigger forward, add the trigger spring into the hole in the back of the trigger, and then lower it into the trigger housing. Before adding the disconnector into the assembly, rotate the sear all the way forward. Tilt the front step of the disconnector under the sear. Make sure that the disconnector seats on the bent leg of the disconnector spring as the disconnector is lowered into position. Align the stud on the disconnector with the hole in the top of the trigger. Lower the trigger into position and push the trigger pin fully into the trigger housing. Add the hammer pin and hammer to the trigger housing. With the hammer in its fully forward position, add the mainspring guide through the back of the trigger assembly and locate it onto the cross pin in the back of the hammer. Seat the mainspring plunger onto the mainspring guide. Add the hammer spring to the mainspring plunger. Slightly compress the hammer spring as the mainspring retention pin is inserted into the trigger housing. Slightly compress the trigger housing pin retaining spring as it is inserted into the trigger housing. This concludes the assembly of the trigger mechanism for the Mossberg Maverick 88.